Welcome to this program, part of a series of classic and contemporary science fiction and fantasy adapted on cassette. Isaac Asimov, master of science fiction and author of the acclaimed Foundation trilogy, wrote the award-winning novel The Gods Themselves in 1972. In this story, a door to another universe suddenly opens, flooding a desperate planet Earth with enough power to solve its energy crisis. Scientist Peter Lamont turns for help to the alien beings who first opened the door. He develops an alliance with them as he attempts to save the world from destruction.
Dua did not have much trouble leaving the others. She always expected trouble, but somehow it never came. But then why should it? Odin objected. "Stay put," he would say. "You know you annoy Trit." He never spoke of his own annoyance. Rationals didn't grow annoyed over trifles. Still, he hovered over Trit almost as persistently as Trit hovered over the children. Odin always let her have her way if she were persistent enough, and would even intercede with Trit. Sometimes he even admitted he was proud of her ability, of her independence. Trit was harder to handle, but then rightlings were like that. He was a rightling to her, but a parental to the children, and the latter took precedence always. Except for melting, Dua tended to ignore him. Odin was another thing. He had been exciting at first. Just his presence had made her outlines shimmer and fade. The fact that he was irrational made him more exciting somehow. She didn't understand her reaction to that. It was part of her queerness. The small sun was at the horizon now, with the secret ruddiness that she alone was there to see. She spread herself out laterally and thickened dorso-ventrally, absorbing the traces of thin warmth. She munched at it idly, savoring the slightly sour, substanceless taste of the long wavelengths. She sat there in the sunset, rebelliously aware that pretty soon Trit would grow petulant over her absence and nag Odin. And then Odin might lecture her on her duties. She didn't care. Odin was moderately aware that Dua was off on the surface. He could judge her direction and even something of her distance. If he had stopped to think of it, he might have felt displeasure. This inter-awareness sense had been steadily deadening, and without being certain why, he had a sense of gathering fulfillment about it. It was the sign of the continuing development of the body with age. Trit's inter-awareness sense did not decrease, but it shifted more toward the children. That was clearly the line of useful development, but then the role of parental was a simple one, however important. The rational was far more complex, and Odin took a bleak satisfaction in that thought. It was Dua who was the real puzzle. She was so unlike all the other emotionals. That puzzled and frustrated Trit and reduced him to even more pronounced inarticulacy. It puzzled and frustrated Odin at times, too. The hard ones seemed interested in her, and ordinarily they paid attention only to rationals. So much the better for the triad that even the emotional was worth attention. Things were as they were supposed to be. Someday he would even know when it was time to pass on, and then he would want to. The hard ones assured all rationals of that, but they also told him that it was his own inner consciousness that would mark the time unmistakably, and not any advice from outside. "When you tell yourself," Loston had told him, in the clear, careful way in which a hard one always talked to a soft one, "that you know why you must pass on, then you will pass on, and your triad will pass on with you." Odin had said, I cannot say I wish to pass on now, hard sir. There is so much to learn.
Of course. You feel this because you are not yet ready.
Odin thought, how could I ever feel ready when I would never feel there wasn't much to learn? He was quite certain the time would come, and he would understand. But he never ceased being thankful that he did not have Trit's limited understanding, or Dua's erratic one. He grew distantly aware of Dua again, and deliberately dulled the sense. It was part of the growing maturity of a rational to find more and more satisfaction in the exercise of a mind that could only be practiced alone, and with the hard ones. He grew constantly more attached to the hard ones. That was right and proper too, for he was a rational, and in a way the hard ones were super-rationals. When Trit first appeared, everything changed. For the first time in his life, Odin felt an inner warmth, and began to think that there was something he wanted that was divorced from thought. They both knew exactly what had happened to them. The meeting had been arranged because someone, some parental, Odin had thought at the time, but later he knew it was some hard one, thought they would suit each other, and the thought was correct. There was no intellectual rapport between the two, of course. Odin wanted to learn with an intensity that superseded anything but the existence of the triad itself. And Trit knew beyond either learning or unlearning. It was Trit who made the first move, driven by his special needs. No one really told Odin about melting in those days. They educated him about everything except what the triad was all about. Trit had never been told either, but he was a parental, so he knew without being told. When Dua came at last, all was clear, even though she knew less about it than Odin. Trit was conscious of his blockiness. His body was designed for a purpose, and designed well. He said, "Odin, where is Dua?" "Outside somewhere," mumbled Odin, almost as though he didn't care. It annoyed Trit to have the triad made so little of. "Why do you let her go?" "How can I stop her, Trit, and what harm does it do?" "You know the harm. We have 2 babies. We need a 3rd. It is so hard to make a little mid these days. And now she's wandering about at sunset again." Trit's voice was caressing. "How can I love you properly without Dua?" Did Odin ever think of the triad and what it meant? Sometimes Trit felt so frustrated. What made Dua as she was? She had always been difficult, but she was growing worse. Surely there was never anyone like Dua in the world. Trit had seen many emotionals. They were all attractive. Once he saw Dua, he realized that none of the others would have suited. Only Dua. And Dua knew exactly what to do. No one had ever shown her how. No one had ever talked to her about it. Yet, when all 3 were together, each knew what to do. Dua thinned. She thinned more than Trit had ever seen a person thin. She thinned more than Trit would have ever thought possible. She became a kind of colored smoke that filled the room and dazzled him. He moved without knowing he was moving. He immersed himself in the air that was Dua. There was no sensation of penetration, none at all. Trit felt just a floating inward and a rapid palpitation. He felt himself beginning to thin in sympathy, with Dua filling him, thin without effort, into a thick smoke of his own. Thinning became one enormous, smooth flow. Dimly, he could see Odin approaching from the other side, from Dua's left. and he too was thinning. Then Trit felt without feeling, knew without knowing. He slid into Odin, and Odin slid into him. He couldn't tell whether he was surrounding Odin or being surrounded by him. Odin said, "That was wonderful." Trit only gazed at Dua, who had made it possible. She was coalescing, moving tremulously. She seemed most affected of the three. "We'll do it again," she said hurriedly, but later. Let me go now." It had been so long since the first melting, and still the baby emotional was not born. And Dua stayed by herself more as time went on. "When it's time," began Odin.
"You always talk about it's being time, or it's not being time. Dua should—"
But Odin turned away. He said,
"If you want to go out and get her, do so, but I say leave her alone."
Trit backed away. He had a great deal to say, but he didn't know how to say it. Dua was aware of the agitation concerning her, and her rebelliousness grew. If one or the other or both came to get her, it would end in a melting, and she raged against the thought. It was all Trit wanted except for the third and last child, and when Trit wanted a melting, he got it. She didn't feel disloyal at the thought. She never expected to feel for either Odin or Trit the sheer intensity of longing that they felt for each other. She could melt alone. They could melt only through her mediation. She felt intense pleasure at the three-way melting, but it was a pleasure akin to that which she felt when she passed through a rock wall, as she sometimes secretly did. Odin had the pleasure of learning. Dua felt some of that at times, enough to know what it might mean, and though it was different from melting, it might serve as a substitute, at least to the point where Odin could do without melting, sometimes. But not so Trit. For him there was only melting and the children. And when his small mind bent entirely upon that, Odin would give in, and then Dua would have to. They had a child eventually, a baby rational that flitted and thinned so that all three were in raptures, and even Odin would hold it and let it change shape in his hands, for as long as Trit would allow him to. For it was Trit, of course, who had incubated it through the long preforming, who had separated from it when it assumed independent existence, and who cared for it at all times. After that, Trit was often not with them, and Dua was oddly pleased. Trit's obsession annoyed her, but Odin pleased her. She became increasingly aware of his importance. Being irrational made it possible to answer questions, and Dua had questions for him constantly. "You've often mentioned energy. What is it exactly?"
"Why, what we eat."
"Well then, why don't you say food?"
"Because food and energy aren't quite the same thing. Our food comes from the sun, and that's a kind of energy. When we eat, we've got to spread out and absorb the light. It's hardest for emotionals because they're much more transparent."
Rationals and parentals were rarely on the surface. Their thickness made it possible for them to eat quickly and leave. Emotionals writhed in the sun for hours. They actually needed more energy than the others, at least for melting. The emotional supplied the energy, Odin had explained. And the little left and the little right came eventually, didn't they? Dua turned away. "I get all the sun I can stand. I don't know what you want of me."
"No," said Odin seriously. "You're not like the others, and I'm glad of it. And if you're interested in rational talk, then let me explain something. The sun doesn't supply the food it used to in ancient times. The birth rate has been dropping, and the world's population is only a fraction of what it once was."
"I can't help it," said Dua rebelliously. "I don't want artificial food." And she left Odin abruptly. She had seen artificial food once, a glowing sphere of light, like a tiny sun, in a special cavern set up by the Hard Ones. She could taste its bitterness yet. No, as long as she didn't have that third child, she would not pass on. She would continue to live. Would she have to eat it then, and fill herself with it, until the full sensation gave her an almost uncontrollable desire to melt? The delay in initiating the third child was indeed becoming too long, and Dua was growing less amenable to persuasion. There was a growing restlessness in Odin himself that he would have to discuss with Loston. He made his way down to the hard caverns, hastening his movements into a continuous flow. Odin had still been quite young when the matter had come up. His relationship with the Hard Ones had only been beginning, and it suddenly struck him that he wasn't sure that there were no triads among them. That fact was common legend among the Soft Ones, but how correct was the legend? Odin thought about that, and decided one must ask and not accept matters on faith. Odin had said, "Are you a left or a right, sir?" In later times, Odin pulsed at the memory of that question. How incredibly naive to have asked it. And it was very little comfort that every rational asked the question of a Hard One in some fashion sooner or later. Loston answered quite calmly, "There are no rationals or parentals among the Hard Ones." "Emotionals?" The Hard One changed the shape of his permanent sensory region in a fashion that Odin associated with amusement. "No, just Hard Ones of one kind." Odin had to ask. It came out involuntarily, quite against his desire. "How do you stand it?" He wanted to talk to Loston about Dua. He made his way along the well-known route. "There are many ways of being unusual," said Odin thoughtfully. "In some ways, Dua's odd ways displease Trit and worry me. She is not fond of melting." Loston listened gravely. Odin went on. "She is fond of melting when we melt, but it is not always easy to persuade her to do so. I sometimes think Dua doesn't want to have a baby emotional." Loston looked at him gravely. "You only have 2 children so far, I think. A little rational and a little parental." "Yes, only 2. The emotional is difficult to initiate, you know." "I know. If Dua had some rational cause for not wanting to initiate an emotional, would that make a difference with you?" "With me, certainly, but not with Trit. He doesn't understand such things." Loston said, "Has it occurred to you that hardly any Soft Ones ever pass on before the children are born? All 3 with the baby emotional last. The birth of a baby emotional is equivalent to the coming of time to pass on. Suppose Dua simply wants never to pass on. What would you then say?" "I don't know," said Odin wretchedly. "Other emotionals cling together all life long and seem to get some pleasure out of it. Dua will not do that." "Well, she is unusual. Is there nothing she likes?" "She likes to listen to me talk about my work," mumbled Odin. Loston said, "Well, don't be ashamed of that, Odin." "But Dua listens, Loston, sir." "I'm quite sure she does. Not like other emotionals. And does it ever seem to you that she understands better after a melt?" "Yes, I have noticed that. I didn't pay any attention, though." "Because you are sure emotionals can't really understand these things. But there seems to be considerable of the rational in Dua. Why not tell her so? Teach her what you know. If Dua gets more out of life and a truer sense of fulfillment,
she might not have the fear of passing on, and might be more ready to have a baby emotional.
It was as though an enormous feeling of impending disaster had been lifted from Odin. He wanted to get back home. He couldn't touch Losten in gratitude, but he could thank him and hasten away joyfully. There was a selfish component to his joy. It was not just the distant prospect of Tritt's pleasure. It was not even the thought of Dua's fulfillment. What counted with him was the gleeful prospect ahead. He was going to be able to teach. No other rational could feel the pleasure of so doing, for no other rational could possibly have an emotional like Dua as part of the triad. It would be wonderful. If only Tritt could be made to understand the necessity. He would have to talk to Tritt, persuade him to be patient. Dua found herself drifting toward the hard caverns. Partly it was because it was something to keep her from returning home, to delay having to listen to the importunities of Tritt and the half-embarrassed, half-resigned suggestions of Odin. Dua had been moving slowly during all this time of reveries. Without noting the passage of either time or space, she found herself in the hard caverns, and was just beginning to wonder if she had really delayed all she safely could, when, without knowing what she was doing, she simply flowed into the nearest wall. She was filled with pure astonishment. Even in her childhood, she had never melted completely into rock. What if she were caught? If a hard one passed and lingered, she could not possibly bring herself to emerge if anyone were watching. But how long could she stay within? And what if they discovered her in the rock? And even as she thought that, she sensed the hard ones, and then realized they were far away. She paused to calm herself. The rock, permeating and surrounding her, lent a kind of grayness to her perception, but didn't dim it. Instead, she sensed more sharply. Her sensitivity was such that she even knew why she was sensitive. Odin had frequently remarked how well he understood something after a period of melting. There was something about the melted state that increased sensitivity incredibly. It was because of the greater atomic density during melting, Odin had said. It was a long time before she detached and flowed out of the rock. And when that time came, she was not concerned overmuch as to whether she would be observed. She was confident enough of her sensing ability to know she wouldn't be. And she returned home deep in thought. When Dua returned home, she found Odin waiting for her. She said, "Odin, I must know. I must know so much." "Come," he said. "I've been waiting for you. Tell me what you want to know. I will explain all I can. You understand that everything is made up of tiny particles called atoms, and these are made up of still tinier subatomic particles." "Yes, yes," said Dua. That's why we can melt." "Exactly. Because actually, we are mostly empty space. All the particles are far apart, and your particles and mine and Tritt's can all melt together because each set fits into the empty spaces around the other set. There are attractive forces holding the particles together, the strongest being the one we call the nuclear force. It holds the chief subatomic particles very tightly together in bunches that are spread widely apart. Matter can exist in different states. It can be especially spread out, as in emotionals, as in you, Dua. It can be a little less spread out, as in rationals and in parentals.
It can be very compressed, as in the hard ones. That's why they're hard. They are filled with particles.
You mean there's no empty space in them?
That's why the hard ones don't like to be touched by us.
Dewar didn't look at all certain about that.
Odin hastened onward. In the other universe, the rules are different. The nuclear force isn't as strong as in ours. That means the particles need more room.
Can we see the other universe?
Oh, no, that isn't possible. We can deduce its nature from its basic laws. We can send material across and get material from them, and we can set up the positron pump. You know about that, don't you?
Do they have that in the other universe?
Yes, but because the nuclear force is weaker, fusion is much slower. This means that the stars must be much, much bigger in the other universe. Otherwise, not enough fusion would take place to make them shine. You don't mind my boring you with all this?
You're not boring me, said Dewar. I love it.
And she wavered between the electrodes with a kind of luxurious tremor. Odin was greatly heartened. He said, "Of course, our universe doesn't last as long as theirs. Fusion goes so fast that all the particles are combined after 1,000,000 lifetimes."
Dewar said, "It's wonderful that we are getting the food from the other universe, then. I mean, it doesn't matter if our sun dies out, then. We can get all the food we want from the other universe."
"That's right."
"But does nothing bad happen? I have the feeling that something bad happens."
"Well," said Odin, "we transfer matter back and forth to make the positron pump, and that means the universes mix together a little. Our nuclear force gets a tiny bit weaker, so fusion in our sun slows up a little, and the sun cools down a little faster."
That's not the something bad feeling I have. If the nuclear force gets weaker, then the atoms take up more room. Is that right? And then what happens to melting?
"That gets harder, but it would take many millions of lifetimes before it would get noticeably harder to melt. Even if melting became impossible and soft ones died out, that would happen long after we would all have died out for lack of food, if we weren't using the other universe."
That's still not the something bad feeling.
Dewar's words were beginning to slur.
She wriggled between her electrodes, and to Odin's gratified eyes she seemed noticeably larger and compacter. It was as though his words were nourishing her.
"Do you want me to go on?" asked Odin, flattered and more pleased.
"Not now, Odin. Oh, Odin, do you know what I want to do?"
Odin guessed at once, but was too cautious to say it openly. Dewar's moments of erotic advance were too few to treat with anything but care. He hoped desperately that Tritt had not involved himself with the children to the point where they could not take advantage of this, but Tritt was in the chamber already. Dewar had flowed out from between the electrodes, and Odin's senses were filled with her beauty. She was between them now, and through her Tritt shimmered, with his outlines flaming in incredible color. Never in the lifetime of the triad had the period of melt unconsciousness lasted so long.
Please turn the cassette over. We continue on the other side.